The voice beside me stopped around dawn. I think it was dawn. The gray had shifted from one shade to another, from the gray of buried things to the gray of things about to be buried, and somewhere in that change, the rasping breath that had kept me company through the night went quiet. I did not look. I kept my eyes on the lip of the crater, on the mud that crept downward in slow rivulets like the land itself was bleeding out, and I listened to the silence where his breathing used to be. That was the second day, or maybe it was still the first. Time had become a wound that would not stop opening. Every minute stretched into something unrecognizable, and I had stopped trusting my own count somewhere between the third artillery barrage and the fourth. The mud beneath me had worked its way through my tunic, through the wool, through whatever remained of the skin on my back. I could feel it there now, cold and intimate, pressing against my spine like a lover's hand, like Eleanor's hand that last morning when she stood at the door of our cottage and placed her palm flat against my chest and said nothing at all. I should not think about Eleanor. Not here. Not with him beside me. The crater was perhaps 15 feet across. It had been made by something enormous, something that had screamed down from the sky months or years ago and torn the earth open like a body on a surgeon's table. The walls sloped inward, steep and treacherous, and at the bottom the water had gathered into a pool the color of rust and old blood. I lay on the eastern slope, my left leg twisted beneath me at an angle I had stopped trying to correct. My rifle cradled against my chest like a child. The bayonet was fixed. I did not remember fixing it. I did not remember a great many things. He lay on the western slope, 3 feet away, close enough that I could smell him when the wind shifted, close enough that in the dark his breathing had become my breathing, had become the only proof that I was still alive at all. I had not looked at his face since the first hour. The attack had begun at 5:30. I remember that much because Lieutenant Harwood had checked his watch, had squinted at it in the pre-dawn murk, had said to no one in particular, 5:30 then, lads, as if it were a train we were catching, as if we were going somewhere ordinary. The whistle had come a moment later, thin and desperate, and then we were up and over, and the world had become a single continuous scream of mud and metal and men. I had gone over the top before, Luz, the Somme. Smaller actions with names that never made the papers. I knew the rhythm of it by then, the way time collapsed into something primal, the way your body moved without consulting your mind. You did not run across no man's land. You waded, you crawled, you fell and rose and fell again, and all around you men were doing the same, or they were not rising at all, and you could not stop to see which because the only thing that mattered was forward. Forward into the wire, forward into the machine guns, forward into whatever waited on the other side. But Passchendaele was different. I understood that within the first 30 seconds, when Private Collins, who had showed me photographs of his daughter just 2 nights before, Collins who had a nervous laugh and a habit of humming hymns, when Collins stepped forward and simply vanished. One moment he was beside me, his boots sucking at the mud, and the next moment there was only the mud, only the surface of it closing over where he had been like water swallowing a stone. The ground was not ground anymore. It was something else, something hungry. I kept moving. That was the only thing I knew how to do. The shells were falling in clusters, throwing up plumes of filth and fragments, and the noise was so complete that it became a kind of silence, a roar so constant that my ears stopped registering it as sound. I saw men fall. I saw men running in the wrong direction, their eyes white with panic. I saw a sergeant, I think it was Sergeant Bell, standing completely still in the middle of the chaos, staring at his own hands as if he had never seen them before. The machine gun found me around the halfway point, or found the men beside me. I felt something tug at my sleeve, felt the air part near my ear, and then I was in a crater, sliding down its muddy slope with my rifle clutched against my chest, and the world above had become a ceiling of smoke and noise and flickering light. I lay there for a long time, minutes, hours. I do not know. The attack continued without me. I could hear the distant shouts, the whistle blasts, the peculiar flat crack of rifles, but it felt removed, theatrical, as if I were watching it through a window. My leg had begun to hurt by then, a deep throb that pulsed in time with my heartbeat, and when I looked down I saw that my trousers were torn and that something pale was showing through the fabric. I did not look closer. Some things are better left unnamed. The fog came with the evening. It rose from the ground like breath, like the earth itself was exhaling after holding its breath all day, and within an hour the visibility had dropped to nothing. I could not see the lip of the crater. I could not see my own hands. I could only hear the distant rumble of artillery, the occasional crack of a rifle, the slow drip of water from somewhere above me, and I could only feel the cold pressing in from all sides like a living thing. That was when I heard him. It was not a shout. It was not a cry for help. It was a sound I had learned to recognize over 3 years of this war, a sound that haunted the spaces between battles, that drifted across no man's land in the quiet hours when the guns fell silent. It was the sound of a man who had stopped believing rescue was possible, but could not stop his body from protesting anyway. A low moan, rhythmic, animal, rising and falling like the tide. I turned my head. The movement sent pain lancing up through my thigh, but I gritted my teeth and completed the motion, squinting into the gray murk. At first there was nothing. Just the slope of the crater, the glint of water at the bottom, the vague shapes of debris scattered like offerings. Then the fog shifted, and I saw him. He was lying on the opposite slope, perhaps 10 feet away, curled on his side with his knees drawn up to his chest. His uniform was dark with mud and something else, something that gleamed wetly in what little light remained, and his face was turned away from me. His hands were pressed against his stomach, and even from that distance I could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigid curve of his spine. My first thought was that he was one of ours. The uniform looked right, the cut of the tunic, the shape of the helmet lying beside him in the mud. My second thought was that I should call out, should let him know he was not alone, should offer whatever comfort one dying man could offer another. But something stopped me, some instinct, some animal awareness that had kept me alive through Luz and the Somme and all the smaller horrors between. I lay still and watched him, and I listened to his moaning, and I did not speak. The night passed in fragments. I drifted in and out of consciousness, pulled under by exhaustion and pain, and then jerked back to the surface by sounds, the distant bark of a gun, the splash of water, his breathing, always his breathing. At some point the artillery stopped. At some point the fog thickened until I could barely see the water at the crater's bottom. At some point I became aware that I was crying, silently, the tears cutting tracks through the mud on my face, though I could not have said what I was crying for. Eleanor, perhaps. I thought of her often in those hours. I thought of the way she had looked on our wedding day, the sunlight catching the copper in her hair, the way she had smiled at me as if I were the only solid thing in a world made of smoke. I thought of the cottage we had rented in the village, the way the light came through the kitchen window in the mornings, the sound of her humming as she worked. I thought of the letters she had sent in the first year. Long letters, desperate letters, letters that smelled of lavender and contained pressed flowers from the garden. And I thought of how those letters had changed over time, how they had grown shorter, how the desperation had faded into something more manageable, more distant. The last letter was in my pocket. I had received it 3 days ago, had read it once and then folded it carefully and tucked it against my heart, and I had not read it again since. But I could feel it there now, damp with mud and rain, and its weight was heavier than anything else I carried. She had written that she hoped I was well. She had written that the garden was doing nicely, that Mrs. Patterson had died in the influenza, that the Hendersons' youngest had taken his first steps. She had written that a man named Arthur, a man I had known vaguely before the war, a man who worked at the mill and had been declared unfit for service due to his lungs, had been helping with the heavier work around the cottage. The roof had needed mending. The fence had fallen in the storm. Arthur had been kind enough to come by most evenings. She had not said anything damning. She had not confessed to anything. She had simply written about Arthur in a way that had made my stomach turn to water. a way that suggested 1,000 small intimacies she had not thought to hide because she no longer thought of them as secrets. The way he took his tea, the way he laughed at her jokes, the way he had fixed the squeaking hinge on the bedroom door she had written, as if it were nothing, as if the bedroom were just another room. I had read the letter once. I had not read it again, but I had thought about it constantly, had turned it over and over in my mind like a stone in a river, wearing it smooth, wearing myself smooth against it. Most evenings, she had written. Most evenings. The man across the crater moaned again, and the sound pulled me back to the present. The fog had thinned slightly. I could make out his shape more clearly now, the hunch of his shoulders, the paleness of his hands, and I realized with a start that hours had passed. The gray had shifted. Dawn was coming, or what passed for dawn in this place. I should speak to him. The thought surfaced slowly, reluctantly, like a body rising from deep water. I should let him know he is not alone. I should ask his name, his unit, whether he can move. I should offer him water, though I had none. I should be human, even here, even now. But still I did not speak. The day passed. The sun never appeared. It was only a rumor behind the clouds, a vague brightening that did nothing to warm the air. But the gray grew lighter, and then held steady, and then began to dim again. Twice I heard voices in the distance, the harsh guttural sounds that I had learned to recognize, and both times I pressed myself flat against the mud and held my breath and prayed that he would stay quiet. He did. His moaning had faded to a whimper by then, a thin sound that barely carried, and I found myself straining to hear it, straining to confirm that he was still alive. I was not sure why it mattered. I was not sure why I wanted him alive. Around midday, or what I judged to be midday, I managed to drag myself closer to the water. The movement was agony, a slow crawl that left me gasping and trembling. But I was desperate. My tongue had swollen in my mouth, had become something foreign and hostile, and I would have drunk anything by then. I would have drunk blood. I would have drunk the filth that pooled at the crater's bottom, thick with corruption and death. I drank it anyway. I cupped my hands and brought the water to my lips, and I drank, and I retched, and I drank again. It tasted of metal and rot and something sweetly chemical. Gas residue, perhaps, or the particular flavor of decomposition. I did not care. I drank until my stomach cramped, and then I lay back against the mud and waited for the nausea to pass. That was when he spoke. His voice was rough, barely louder than a whisper, but in the silence of the crater it was shockingly clear. He spoke a single word, or perhaps two. I could not tell, could not parse the sounds, and then he was silent again. But I had heard enough. Enough to recognize the shape of the syllables, the cadence, the particular music of vowels and consonants. He was not speaking English. The cold that washed through me had nothing to do with the mud or the rain or the deepening gray of the day. I lay very still, my heart pounding against my ribs, and I stared at the shape of him across the crater. German. He was German. One of theirs, not one of ours. A soldier from the other side who had ended up in the same hole through some cruel joke of trajectory and chance. My hand found my rifle. The bayonet was still fixed, the blade slick with mud but still sharp. I could be across the crater in seconds. I could end him before he knew what was happening. I could, but I did not move. I lay there with my hand on my rifle and I watched him, and I thought about what it would mean to kill a wounded man. A man who had not threatened me. A man who had not even looked at me. A man who was dying anyway, slowly, in the same mud that was killing me. The Somme had taught me many things. It had taught me that I was capable of killing, that the act was simpler than I had imagined, that the body knew what to do even when the mind refused to participate. It had taught me that men died in ways that bore no resemblance to the stories, that they screamed and begged and soiled themselves, that they called for their mothers in languages I did not understand. It had taught me that survival was not heroism, that luck was not virtue, that the line between the living and the dead was arbitrary and meaningless. But it had not taught me this. It had not taught me how to lie 3 feet from an enemy and do nothing. It had not taught me how to share a hole with a man I was supposed to hate, a man I was supposed to want dead, a man whose countrymen had killed Collins and Bell and so many others whose names I could barely remember anymore. I did not kill him. I do not know why. I told myself it was strategy, that the movement might draw attention, that his moaning was quiet enough not to attract patrols, that any action was more dangerous than inaction. But I knew even then that I was lying to myself. The truth was simpler and more shameful. I did not want to be alone. The night came again, and with it the cold. I had thought I understood cold. I had spent winters in the trenches, had stood watch in temperatures that turned breath to ice. But this was different. This cold came from inside, from the core of me, spreading outward through my veins until my fingers went numb and my teeth began to chatter. The wound on my leg had stopped hurting. I knew that was bad. I knew what it meant when wounds stopped hurting. He was breathing faster now. I could hear it across the crater, a rapid, shallow panting that spoke of fever, of infection, of a body fighting battles it could not win. Twice he called out, not words, just sounds, inarticulate cries that rose and fell like music, and twice I pressed myself flat and prayed that no one heard. The letter was still in my pocket. I reached for it without thinking, my fingers clumsy and thick, and I pulled it out and held it against my chest. The paper was ruined, soaked through, the ink smeared beyond reading, but I did not need to read it. I had memorized every word. I had turned them over in my mind until they lost all meaning, until they became just sounds, just shapes, just the particular cruelty of hope stripped away. Arthur had been kind enough to come by most evenings. I wondered if she knew I was dying. I wondered if she would feel it somehow, if there was some thread connecting us that would snap when I finally let go. I wondered if she was thinking of me at this moment, or if she was thinking of him, Arthur with his bad lungs and his kind hands and his presence in my home, in my life, in all the spaces I had left behind. The fog pressed closer. The man across the crater was crying now. I could hear the wet hitching of his breath, the small whimpers that escaped between his teeth, and I found myself counting them, using them to mark time. 1, 2, 3, breathe. 1, 2, 3, breathe. I thought about Eleanor on our wedding night. The cottage had been cold. It was November, and we could not afford much coal, and we had lain in bed together with the blankets pulled up to our chins, our breath fogging the air between us. She had told me she was afraid, not of the wedding night, not of the act, but of what came after, of the years stretching out before us, of the choices we would make, of the people we would become. I'll come back, I had told her. Whatever happens, I'll come back to you. She had looked at me with those gray-green eyes, and she had smiled, and she had said nothing at all. 3 years. 3 years since that night. 3 years of mud and blood and the particular madness that comes from watching men die in ways that strip all meaning from the word. 3 years of letters that grew shorter, of silences that grew longer, of the slow, cold realization that the man I had been was disappearing, was being replaced by something harder and emptier and less recognizable. I had changed. Of course I had changed. How could I not have changed? But I had expected her to wait. I had expected her to hold on to the memory of who I had been, to keep it safe until I could return and reclaim it. I had expected her to be the fixed point, the anchor, the thing that did not move even as everything else was swept away. Most evenings, the man across the crater went quiet sometime in the deepest part of the night, not dead. I could still hear him breathing, barely, but quiet, as if he had finally exhausted himself, as if there was nothing left inside him worth crying over. I lay in the mud and listened to the silence, and I thought about what it meant that I had not killed him when I had the chance. I had killed before. That was not the issue. I had killed with rifle and bayonet, and once at loose with my bare hands wrapped around a man's throat. I had killed men who were running away, and men who were surrendering, and men who were already wounded. I had killed in rage and in fear and in the cold, empty efficiency that comes from doing something often enough that it stops requiring thought. But this was different. This man was dying anyway. Killing him would serve no purpose, would not save my life, would not help my unit, would not advance any objective that I could name. It would be murder, pure and simple, and though I had committed atrocities that would haunt me for whatever remained of my life, I had not yet crossed that particular line. Or perhaps I had. Perhaps the lines had all blurred together long ago, and I was simply telling myself stories to make the horror manageable. That was what we did, after all. That was how we survived, not through courage or virtue, but through the careful construction of narratives that let us live with ourselves. I was a good man who had been forced to do bad things. I was protecting my country, my home, my wife. I would return to my old life when the war ended, and I would forget all of this, and I would be who I had been before. Lies. All of them lies. But I clung to them anyway because the alternative was to accept that I had become something I could not recognize, something that would not be welcome in the cottage with the squeaky bedroom door, something that Eleanor had perhaps sensed even before I had. Maybe that was why she had turned to Arthur. Maybe she had read something in my letters, the things I said, the things I didn't say, that had frightened her. Maybe she had understood before I did that the man she had married was never coming home. The dawn came gray and cold, and I opened my eyes without realizing I had closed them. The fog had lifted slightly. I could see the opposite slope of the crater clearly now, could see the dark shape of the man lying there, could see the way his chest rose and fell with each labored breath. He was facing me now. At some point in the night he had turned, or been turned, and I could see his face for the first time. He was young. That was my first thought. Too young. His cheeks were gaunt and pale, and his eyes were closed, and there was blood on his lips. Old blood, dried to a rust-colored crust. His uniform was definitely German, the Feldgrau visible beneath the mud, and his hands were still pressed against his stomach, still trying to hold in whatever was trying to escape. I watched him for a long time. I watched the way his breath fogged the air, the way his fingers twitched against his belly, the way his eyelids fluttered as if he were dreaming. I wondered what he was dreaming about. I wondered if he had a wife, a home, a life waiting for him on the other side of this war. I wondered if he had received letters that had slowly stopped meaning what they said. Around mid-morning he opened his eyes. They were blue, a pale washed-out blue like the sky in winter, like ice forming on the surface of a pond. They found me immediately, found my face, my uniform, my rifle with its fixed bayonet, and for a moment there was nothing in them. No fear, no recognition, just a kind of distant curiosity, as if he were looking at something very far away. Then he spoke. The words were German. I caught a few of them. Wasser, I thought, which meant water, but the rest blurred together into incomprehensible music. His voice was barely a whisper, barely stronger than the wind that moaned across the crater's lip, and even that small effort seemed to exhaust him. His eyes fluttered closed again, and he lay still, and for a moment I thought he was gone. But he was not gone. He was simply waiting. Waiting for an answer I could not give. Waiting for help I could not provide. Waiting for something, anything in this place where there was nothing left to wait for. I did not move. I did not speak. I lay in the mud and watched him, and I thought about Eleanor, and I thought about the cottage, and I thought about the bedroom door that no longer squeaked because a man named Arthur had fixed it. The hours blurred, the gray light held steady, neither brightening nor fading, trapped in some perpetual twilight that felt like the end of all things. Twice I heard sounds from beyond the crater, the crump of distant artillery, the rattle of machine guns, once the unmistakable sound of men moving through mud. But each time the sounds faded without approaching, without discovering us, without breaking the strange intimacy of our shared grave. I thought about dying. I thought about it with a clarity that should have frightened me but did not. The wound on my leg had begun to smell, a sweet, sickly odor that I recognized from the aid stations, from the piles of limbs stacked behind the surgeon's tent. Infection, gangrene perhaps, the kind of rot that spread through flesh like fire through dry grass, consuming everything in its path. I would die here. That much was certain now. I would die in this crater with this German soldier, and our bodies would lie here together until the war moved on, or the mud swallowed us, or some burial party found us and threw us into a common grave. My name would go on a list. A telegram would be sent. Eleanor would receive it and she would weep. Or perhaps she would not weep. Perhaps she had already done her grieving. Perhaps my death would be merely the confirmation of something she had accepted long ago. Arthur would comfort her. Arthur would hold her while she cried, if she cried, and Arthur would be there when the crying stopped. Arthur would sleep in my bed and eat at my table and walk the fields where I had once walked with my father, before the war, before everything. I should hate Arthur. I understood that. I should burn with rage at the thought of him in my home, in my life, in my wife. But the rage would not come. There was only a kind of tired sadness, a hollow ache where the anger should have been, and I understood that this too was a kind of dying. The parts of me that could feel such things were shutting down, one by one, like lamps being extinguished in an empty house. The German opened his eyes again as the evening came on. The gray had begun to deepen, the shadows pooling in the crater's bottom, and I watched his face emerge from the murk, like something surfacing from deep water. His lips moved. No sound came out. His eyes found mine again, and this time there was something in them. Not fear, not anger, but something that looked almost like recognition. He thought I was going to kill him. I could see it in the way his body tensed, in the small involuntary movement of his hand toward the pistol at his belt. He had a pistol. I had not noticed it before, half buried in the mud at his hip, and for a moment the realization sent ice through my veins. He was armed. He could shoot me. He could... But his hand fell away before it reached the weapon. His eyes closed. His breath shuddered out of him in a long, wet rattle, and he was still again, and I understood that he was too weak to do anything, that we were both too weak, that the mud had claimed us and all that remained was the waiting. I do not know what made me speak. Perhaps it was the silence, pressing down on me like a physical weight. Perhaps it was the realization that these might be my last hours, that I would die without having said a single word to the only other living creature within reach. Perhaps it was simply the need to hear something other than his breathing, other than the endless drip of water, other than the rattle and moan of the wind. "My name is Thomas," I said. My voice was barely a croak. I had not spoken in 2 days, and my throat was raw and thick. But in the silence of the crater it sounded obscenely loud. "Thomas Marsh, Yorkshire. Do you understand? You?" His eyes opened. He looked at me for a long moment and then, slowly, painfully, he nodded. "Kurt," he said. The word was barely audible, a breath shaped into syllables. "Kurt Weber. Bremen. Bremen." I knew nothing about Bremen. I knew nothing about Kurt Weber. I knew only that he was young, perhaps younger than me, and that he was dying in the same mud that was killing me, and that his eyes were the color of winter ice. We lay in silence after that. It was not a comfortable silence. There was nothing comfortable about any of this, but it was something, an acknowledgement, a recognition that we were here together, that the war had brought us to the same hole in the earth, that whatever happened next would happen to both of us. I thought about killing him again. The thought surfaced like a bloated corpse, inevitable and grotesque, and I let it float there without acting on it. There was no point now. Whatever advantage I might have gained was long gone. We were both dying, both trapped, both beyond the reach of rescue. His death would not save me. It would only mean that I died alone. I did not want to die alone. The night came. The fog descended. The cold wrapped around us like a shroud, and I lay in the mud and listened to Kurt Weber's breathing, and I thought about all the choices that had led me here. The choice to enlist back in 1914, when the recruiters came to the village and the bands played and everyone said it would be over by Christmas. The choice to marry Eleanor quickly before I shipped out, because we had been sweethearts since childhood, and it seemed like the right thing to do. The choice to keep going over the top, attack after attack, battle after battle, when other men found ways to disappear, wounds, transfers, madness real or feigned. I had not chosen any of this. That was the lie I told myself. I had simply been carried along by forces beyond my control, swept up in something larger than myself, deposited here in this crater by the same blind chance that had killed Collins and spared me. I was not responsible. I was not guilty. I was simply unlucky. But that was not true. I had made choices, small ones perhaps, but choices nonetheless. I had chosen to fix my bayonet. I had chosen to keep going when the man beside me went down. I had chosen, in 100 small moments, to survive, and survival in this war was never innocent. It always came at a cost. It always meant that someone else had paid the price. I thought about Eleanor again. I tried to picture her face, to hold it in my mind, but the image kept slipping away. I could remember fragments, the curve of her cheek, the way her hair fell across her forehead, the small scar on her chin from a childhood fall, but I could not assemble them into a whole. She was becoming abstract, theoretical, an idea rather than a person. Maybe that was why her letter had hurt so much, not because of what she had written, but because it had reminded me that she was real, that she was still out there, living her life, making her choices, while I lay in the mud and slowly forgot what it meant to be human. Most evenings, I pulled the letter from my pocket. The paper fell apart in my hands, ruined, destroyed by the mud and the rain and the long wet hours. But I tried to read it anyway. I tilted it toward the gray light, squinting at the smeared ink, trying to make out words that were no longer there. I could see fragments. Love, hope, Arthur, most. Evenings. The paper tore. A piece of it came away in my fingers, and I looked at it for a long moment, at the way the ink had bled into meaningless stains, at the way the fiber of the paper had softened into something almost organic. This was all that remained of Eleanor. This was all I had carried with me across the mud and the wire and the bodies. A handful of pulp, a few smears of ink, a message that no longer existed. I let it go. I let the pieces fall from my fingers into the mud at the crater's bottom, and I watched them sink into the rust-colored water, and I felt something shift inside me. Not grief, exactly. Not anger. Something quieter. Something final. She was gone. Not dead. I knew that. But gone from me. Gone from the life I had imagined. Gone from the future I had clung to through all the horror of the past 3 years. She would marry Arthur, or she would not. But either way, she would move forward. She would have children, perhaps. She would grow old. She would become someone I did not know, someone I could not imagine, and I would become nothing. A name on a list, a telegram, a vague sadness that faded with time. Kurt Weber was watching me. I could feel his gaze even through the fog, and when I turned my head I saw his eyes glinting in the darkness. He had seen me. He had seen me reading the letter, had seen the way my hands trembled, had seen me let it fall. He did not speak. He did not need to speak. Some things were universal. I thought about asking him. I thought about bridging the gap between us with questions. Did he have a wife? Did he have children? Did he have anyone waiting for him back in Bremen? But the words would not come. The silence had grown too thick, too layered, too complete to break with something as ordinary as conversation. Instead, I lay back against the mud and looked up at the sky. There were no stars. There were never stars anymore. Not here. Not in this place where the air was thick with smoke and the clouds hung low and gray and eternal. But I looked anyway, searched the darkness for some point of light, some reminder that there was a world beyond this crater, beyond this war, beyond the slow cold failure of my body. I found nothing. The third day began without my noticing. The gray shifted, the fog thinned, and suddenly it was morning and I was still alive. I had not expected to be alive. I had drifted off at some point in the night, had let the cold pull me under, and I had been certain, absolutely certain, that I would not surface again. But here I was, breathing, aching, dying, still, but more slowly than I had hoped. Kurt Weber was not moving. I stared at his chest for a long time, waiting for it to rise, waiting for some sign of life, but there was nothing. His eyes were closed. His face was slack. His hands had fallen away from his stomach, and I could see now what they had been hiding. A dark, wet ruin, a wound that had been killing him since long before we shared this hole. He was dead. I should have felt something. Relief, perhaps, that I no longer had to worry about his moaning attracting patrols, or grief that the only other living creature in my world had left me, or guilt that I had done nothing to help him, had simply watched him die while I lay 3 feet away. But I felt nothing. There was nothing left to feel. The cold had stripped it all away, had reduced me to something mechanical, something that breathed and blinked and waited for the next moment without understanding why. I looked at his body for a long time. I studied the lines of his face, the way his jaw had slackened, the way the blood on his lips had dried to a dark crust. He was young, younger than me, I thought, 22 perhaps, 23. He had probably been a boy when the war started, had probably grown up in its shadow, had probably never known a world without the sound of guns. I wondered who would mourn him. I wondered if there was a girl in Bremen waiting for letters that would never come, reading and rereading the last one, trying to find meaning in words that had become artifacts. I wondered if she had someone, an Arthur of her own perhaps, who would comfort her when the telegram arrived. I hoped she did. That surprised me. I hoped that whoever loved Kurt Weber would not be alone when they learned he was gone, that someone would hold them, that they would not have to face the enormity of that loss in an empty room. I had not thought I was capable of hoping for anything anymore. The afternoon brought sounds, voices closer than before, moving through the fog in bursts of harsh German. I pressed myself flat against the mud, hardly breathing, and I watched the lip of the crater with eyes that burned from lack of sleep. They were looking for their dead. That was what they did in the quiet periods, both sides. They sent out parties to retrieve the bodies, to count the losses, to close the eyes of men who would never see home again. Would they find us? Would they peer over the edge of this crater and see 2 men lying in the mud, one dead and one dying? Would they pull Kurt Weber out and leave me here? Or would they put a bullet in my head to spare the ammunition? The voices faded, the footsteps moved away, the fog closed in again, and I was alone. I thought about calling out. The thought came suddenly, unbidden, and I turned it over in my mind with something like curiosity. I could shout. I could wave my arms. I could attract their attention and surrender. And maybe, they would take me prisoner instead of killing me. Maybe I would survive. Maybe I would spend the rest of the war in a camp somewhere, eating thin soup and dreaming of home. But what home? The cottage belonged to Eleanor now, to Eleanor and Arthur. The village would remember me as one of many who had gone and not returned. My mother had died in the influenza, I knew from the letters, and my father had followed her 6 months later, and there was no one left, no one waiting, no one who would recognize my face or remember my name. I did not call out. The evening came. I was weaker now. I could feel it in the way my limbs trembled, in the way my thoughts scattered and reformed like clouds in a high wind. The wound on my leg had stopped smelling, which meant something was very wrong. I did not look at it. I did not want to see what I was becoming. Kurt Weber's body was beginning to stiffen. I watched it happen. Watched the slow process of death claiming what remained of him. and I thought about what it meant that I would soon look the same, pale, rigid, empty, a thing rather than a person, a problem to be solved, a weight to be moved, a number to be added to a list. I should pray. The thought surfaced from somewhere deep, from the years before the war, from Sunday services in the village church where I had sat beside my mother and mouthed the words without understanding them. I should pray for my soul, for Eleanor, for the men I had killed and the men I had failed to save. I should make peace with whatever waited on the other side. But I did not pray. I had stopped believing in prayer sometime during the psalm, had watched too many men die with the Lord's Prayer on their lips, had seen too much evidence that no one was listening. If there was a God, He had abandoned this place long ago. He had looked at what we were doing to each other, and He had turned away, and I did not blame Him. I would have turned away too. The night came. The cold came. The darkness wrapped around me like water, and I let myself sink into it, let myself drift toward whatever waited on the other side. But sleep would not come, or it came in fragments, in bursts, in strange half-dreams that blurred the line between waking and unconscious. I saw Eleanor standing at the edge of the crater, looking down at me with those gray-green eyes. I saw Arthur beside her, his arm around her waist, his face kind and concerned. I saw them turning away, walking back toward the cottage, and I tried to call out, but my voice would not work, would not carry, would not reach them. I saw my mother in the kitchen of our old house, kneading bread the way she had when I was a child. I saw my father in the fields, his back bent over the plow, his hands rough and strong and patient. I saw the village as it had been before the war, the church steeple, the green, the pub where I had taken my first drink on my 18th birthday, and I felt something break open inside me, some wall I had built to keep the grief at bay. I wept. For the first time since I could remember, I wept. Great heaving sobs that shook my entire body, that sent pain lancing through my wounded leg, that left me gasping and trembling in the darkness. I wept for Eleanor, and for Kurt Weber, and for Collins, and for all the men I had killed, and all the men I had failed to save. I wept for the boy I had been, and the thing I had become, for the life I had imagined, and the death I was facing, for everything that had been taken and everything I had surrendered. I wept until there was nothing left, until my chest ached, and my throat was raw, and my eyes burned in their sockets. And then I lay still, and I listened to the silence, and I waited for whatever came next. The fourth day dawned gray and cold, and I was still alive. I could not understand it. I could not understand how my body kept functioning, kept breathing, kept clinging to life when there was nothing left to live for. My leg was numb from the thigh down, a bad sign I knew, a very bad sign, and my thoughts moved slowly, sluggishly, as if pushing through deep water. But I was alive. Against all logic, against all expectation, I was alive. Kurt Weber was still dead. His body had settled into the mud now, had begun to merge with it, to become part of the landscape. His face was gray, almost the same color as the sky, and his eyes had sunk into their sockets. He looked peaceful. That was the strange thing. He looked more peaceful dead than he had looked alive. I wondered if I would look the same. I wondered if someone would find us eventually, months from now, years from now, and puzzle over the two bodies in the crater, the English soldier and the German, lying side by side like brothers. They would not know our names. They would not know our stories. They would simply bury us together, or leave us where we lay, and the mud would claim us, and we would become nothing. It seemed fitting somehow. After all the killing, after all the hatred, we would end up the same. Just bodies, just meat, just the particular arrangement of atoms that had once been men. I heard voices again around midday. Different voices this time. English voices, rough Yorkshire vowels that made something twist in my chest. They were looking for survivors. They were looking for men like me. I should call out. I should raise my hand, should shout, should make some sign that I was here, that I was alive, that I had not yet joined Kurt Weber in the democracy of the dead. But my mouth would not open, my arm would not rise. I lay in the mud and listened to the voices fade, and I understood that something in me had made a decision, that some part of me had chosen this, had chosen silence, had chosen to let the patrol pass by. Why? I did not know. Perhaps I was too tired. Perhaps I was too far gone. Perhaps some animal part of my brain understood that survival would only prolong the suffering, that rescue would mean hospitals and amputations, and the long, slow process of learning to live with what I had become. Or perhaps I simply did not want to be saved. Perhaps Eleanor's letter had done something to me, had cut some final thread, had convinced me that there was nothing worth returning to. Most evenings, she had written. Most evenings Arthur came by. Most evenings I was not there, had never been there, had been nothing but a memory she was slowly forgetting. I lay in the mud, and I thought about dying. I thought about what it would feel like when my heart finally stopped, when the gray light faded to black, when the endless cold became something warmer, something final. I thought about the relief of it. No more pain, no more fear, no more waiting in the dark for something that would never come. I thought about Kurt Weber, about the way he had looked at me in those last hours, with something that might have been recognition, about the way we had shared our names, had acknowledged each other's existence, had become, for a brief moment, something more than enemies. He had died with me beside him. He had not died alone. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all any of us could hope for. The evening came. The gray deepened. The cold wrapped around me like water, and I felt myself slipping, felt the edges of consciousness beginning to blur and fade. This was it. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when the struggle finally ended and the silence became complete. But then I heard it, a voice, faint at first, barely distinguishable from the wind, but growing louder, closer, an English voice calling my name. Thomas, Thomas Marsh, Yorkshire. Are you there? I opened my eyes. The fog had parted slightly, and I could see a figure at the lip of the crater, a face peering down at me, pale and worried and achingly familiar. Corporal Davis. I knew him. We had shared a cigarette 2 days ago, before the attack. He had showed me a photograph of his daughter. I tried to speak. I tried to raise my hand, to make some sign that I was alive, that I was here, that I had not yet given up. But nothing happened. My body would not respond. I lay in the mud, paralyzed by cold and exhaustion, and something deeper, something that felt like choice. And I watched Davis scan the crater, his eyes passing over Kurt Weber's body, passing over mine. He did not see me. The mud had claimed me, had made me part of the landscape, and he looked at me without recognition. Then he turned away. I heard his footsteps receding, heard him calling to someone else, heard the patrol moving on. The fog closed in again and the silence returned, and I was alone. I should have called out, I should have fought, should have screamed, should have done something, anything to save myself. But I lay still, and I watched the gray sky, and I felt something that might have been peace settle over me. Kurt Weber was dead. Eleanor was gone. The life I had known, the man I had been, they were casualties of this war, as surely as Collins, as surely as the thousands of bodies rotting in the mud all around me. There was nothing left to save. I closed my eyes. The cold pressed closer, and somewhere in the distance, the guns began again. I do not know how long I lay there after the patrol passed. Time had lost all meaning. There were only the sounds, the distant rumble of artillery, the drip of water, the rasp of my own breathing, and the cold, always the cold, seeping into my bones like something alive. I thought about Eleanor one last time, not with anger, not with grief, but with something like gratitude. She had been my reason for surviving, my anchor in the chaos, and now that she was gone, I could finally let go. I could finally stop fighting. I could finally rest. The letter lay somewhere at the bottom of the crater, buried in the mud with Kurt Weber and all the other things the war had claimed. I could not remember what it said anymore. I could not remember her face or her voice or the way she had looked on our wedding day. There was only the cold and the silence and the gray light fading to black. I am still here. That thought came suddenly, unexpectedly, from some part of me that refused to surrender. I am still here. I am still breathing. I am still alive. The words seemed to echo in the silence, and for a moment I felt something stir. Not hope exactly, but something older, something more primal. The same instinct that had carried me across no man's land, that had kept me moving when the man beside me went down, that had brought me this far against all odds. I did not want to die. Not really. Not like this. I opened my eyes. The crater was dim now, the gray light fading toward darkness, but I could still see Kurt Weber's body lying motionless on the opposite slope. I could still see my own hands, pale and trembling, pressed against the mud at my sides. I could still feel the cold, the pain, the slow failure of my body, but I could also feel something else. A heartbeat, faint, irregular, but there, still there. I began to move. It was agony. Every inch sent pain searing through my ruined leg. Every motion disturbed the mud that had settled around me, and twice I had to stop and press my face into the earth and simply breathe. But I kept moving, upward, toward the lip of the crater, toward the world beyond. I did not know what I would find when I got there. More mud, perhaps. More death. More of the same endless gray wasteland that had swallowed so many better men than me. But it did not matter. What mattered was the movement. What mattered was the choice. Kurt Weber had died waiting. I would not. The lip of the crater was steeper than I remembered, the mud more treacherous, and twice I slid back down, my fingers clawing uselessly at the earth. But on the third try I found a root, the last remnant of some long-dead tree, and I pulled myself up, inch by inch, until my head crested the edge, and I could see the battlefield beyond. It was empty, gray and ruined and utterly still. The fog hung low over the churned earth, and in the distance I could see the dark shapes of other craters, other graves, other places where men had died or were dying. But there was no movement, no sound, just the wind and the silence and the long, slow march of clouds across a colorless sky. I pulled myself over the edge and lay on my back, gasping for breath. The effort had cost me everything. I could feel my heart racing, my vision swimming, my body trembling on the edge of collapse. But I was out. I was free of the crater, free of Kurt Weber's silent companionship, free of the hole that had been my grave for 2 days. I lay there for a long time. I watched the clouds move overhead, and I thought about Eleanor, and I thought about the letter, and I thought about what it meant that I had chosen to live. It was not courage, I knew that. It was not heroism or virtue or any of the things the newspapers wrote about. It was something simpler, something more animal, the same blind impulse that made rats flee a sinking ship, that made birds take flight at the first sign of danger, survival. That was all, just survival. But maybe that was enough. I do not know how long I lay there before the stretcher bearers found me. Hours, perhaps, or minutes. Time had become unreliable, elastic, something that stretched and contracted without warning. I only knew that at some point there were faces above me, English faces tired and muddy and kind, and hands lifting me, and voices asking questions I could not answer. They carried me back across the battlefield, through the mud and the wire and the shell holes, and I watched the gray sky pass overhead, and I thought about Kurt Weber lying alone in his crater, waiting for someone who would never come. He had died with me beside him. He had not died alone. Maybe that was the only thing I had given him, the only thing I had left to give. The aid station was a blur of noise and light and pain. They cut away my trousers. They looked at my leg. Someone made a sound. I do not know if it was a word or just an exhalation. And then there were more hands, more faces, more questions I could not answer. I survived. That is what the records say. Private Thomas Marsh, Yorkshire Regiment, wounded at Passchendaele, evacuated to a field hospital and then to England. Leg amputated below the knee. Discharged from service. Returned to civilian life. But the records do not tell the whole story. They do not tell you about the nightmares, about the long, silent hours when the smell of mud and blood and death seemed to fill every room. They do not tell you about the letter I never wrote to Eleanor, about the cottage I never returned to, about the village I passed through once, years later, without stopping. They do not tell you about Kurt Weber, about the way his eyes looked in the moment before he died, about the strange peace I felt lying beside him in the darkness. They do not tell you about the choice I made, there at the edge of the crater, when I decided to live even though I had nothing left to live for. I am an old man now. The war ended long ago, and another war came and went, and the world moved on without me. But sometimes, on nights when the fog rolls in and the cold settles into my bones, I find myself back in that crater. I find myself lying beside Kurt Weber, listening to his breathing, watching the gray light fade to black. And I wonder, who was I really in those 2 days? The man who chose not to kill, the man who chose not to call out, the man who crawled out of his own grave and kept living even when there was nothing left to live for? I do not know. I have never known. I only know that the voice beside me, the voice that kept me company through the longest nights of my life, was not on my side, and neither perhaps was I. But I am still here. After all this time, after everything, I am still here. And maybe that is the only truth that matters.